Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of Hegel's key ideas that he is discussing in the Phenomenology and developing in the SelfConsciousness section has to do with the varied nature of self-consciousness and its relation to desire, and through desire, to another self-consciousness. We're not going to explore all of that here. We're going to be focusing in this particular video on sections 173 to 177, which lead us up to what's famously called the master-slave dialectic, or dialectic of lordship and bondage. We'll talk about that separately. Here we want to think about the very nature of self-consciousness itself before we go into it. And Hegel is going to tell us at the beginning of this that self-consciousness needs to attain a kind of certainty of itself. Why does it have to do that? At its foundation, self-consciousness is not just relational to its object, but it makes itself an object. That is part of what it means to be self-conscious. And this is something we do all the time, whether we are conscious of it in an explicit way or not. We're always implicitly conscious of it. When I say, oh, should I watch this video? And I have that I in there, I am, you might say, exercising self-consciousness. I'm asking myself to make a choice about whether it's worth my time or whether I should be doing something else. And that involves thinking about what it is that I am and what the point of my activities are. There's all these other things enfolded into it. Now, we don't have to get quite so concrete with this at the very beginning. He says self-consciousness attains certainty of itself only by superseding, and this is a translation of a German term here that's very important in Hegel's work, aufheben, which is a verb, which means something like to transcend, but to bring along the essential components along the way. Or to integrate would be another way of thinking about it. When you integrate something within a larger whole, you remove some of the independence of the parts and you synthesize them into something that has a greater type of unity and probably more dynamicity as well. So by superseding its object. Now, what is the object of self-consciousness? You could say that in a way it is just itself, but that doesn't turn out to be the case for Hegel. We don't have what we call in philosophy a solipsism here, where I am the center of the universe and everything else is merely figments of my imagination or whatever it is that I make of them existing only in relation to me. No, it is an other, a real other, that is going to provide the object for self-consciousness. That doesn't mean that we're not constantly engaged with a world of objects that don't possess self-consciousness. Everything from books to pieces of chalk, to our clothing items, to the lighting in this room, whatever it is else that you like, and including other animals that don't exhibit the same structure of self-consciousness that Hegel's talking about. But we only have the true meaning of our self-consciousness and the full potentiality of it when we exist in relation to an other. And this is something that self-consciousness is, whether it realizes it or not, constantly striving to do. To figure out what it is and what kind of being it is and how it should be by integrating, transcending, superseding its object. So Hegel goes on and tells us something really key here about this process in telling us that this is the nature of self-consciousness as desire, Begierde in German. He says, here we go, Self-consciousness is desire, certain of the nothingness of this other. It explicitly affirms that this nothingness is for it the truth of this other. Now, that sounds very abstract, but if we think about what that means, when we have desire for something, like, for instance, I desire to read and understand Hegel, it presents itself to me as, here's just my task or the object in front of me, the thing that is confronting me. But I myself act upon it. I myself penetrate into it. I make it my own. In doing so, I remove its independence. I, in a sense, negate it. I introduce the nothingness or the negation that's involved within that thing. And now that's just an object, although books are an interesting sort of object since they mediate to us the thoughts of another person. If I say I truly want to understand Hegel, that means that for Hegel, in a certain sense, I want to assimilate. I want to dominate. I want to consume Hegel. And there's only a certain amount of mileage that I can get out of this in terms of treating objects that way. So he goes on and he says, by destroying the independent object, I give myself the certainty of myself as a true certainty. I integrate truth and certainty together, a certainty which has become explicit for self-consciousness itself in an objective manner. And that's just a first step. But now realizing this function of desire within self-consciousness itself as integral to its very nature is key. Hegel goes on and talks about why it is that we have to focus upon objects that are like ourselves, not just the world of objects that we might come across, again, like pieces of chalk. These cannot provide me truly what I want. They're great for writing on the board, but they can't provide me what it is that my desire is fundamentally for. So Hegel is opening up to us the nature of what our deeper desires are. Desire wants to consume the object. It wants to turn the object into the nothingness that it is. So I see the sandwich, I'm hungry. That's the literal translation of Begierde, hunger, right? See the sandwich, oh, it looks good. I'm going to eat it all up, and then it's gone. Now, well, it's not gone, Dr. Sadler. It's been consumed. It's in your belly. Well, that is aufgehoben. Aufgehoben, rather. I have transmuted it into bits of me, and I'm going to work on it myself with my organs. And we could talk about this with other things. You buy a book because you want to master a particular skill, and you're going to throw that book away when you're done with it. You've turned it into a lifeless husk that now you can cast aside. Now, what about people? What about our relations with human beings? This is where it gets particularly interesting. Hegel thinks that what we want is for objects to negate themselves within themselves. We don't just want to exercise our own agency on these objects. We want them to be for us, to do for us, to make themselves for us. And we also, at the same time, need the object to be independent, because as soon as the object has lost its independence, it's no longer quite as interesting for us. It no longer arouses our desire. It no longer provides satisfaction to the same extent. So we have something paradoxical here in self-consciousness, particularly because what self-consciousness is desiring is another self-consciousness. Hegel tells us that self-consciousness attains its satisfaction, Befriedigung in German, only in another self-consciousness. And here he brings in a key term, Anerkennen in German, which we translate as recognition in most cases, or acknowledgement is another way to put it. And we're going to talk more about that in other places, about exactly what the nature of recognition consists in. But what Hegel is saying is that fundamentally we are looking not just for consuming objects the way animals do, but understanding ourselves through being recognized by others. And that means also understanding ourselves as beings that do, in fact, recognize others as others. So he's going to talk about this in terms of self-consciousness existing for another self-consciousness. And this is going to get us to the point of talking about spirit, or Geist in German. So he says, a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is it, in fact, self-consciousness. For only in this way does the unity of itself in its otherness become explicit for us. Hegel says that we only truly know ourselves in a matrix with other people. We cannot know ourselves and be certain of what it is that we are and be satisfied with ourselves without some connection with the other. They provide us with a kind of necessary mediating term. So he goes on and he tells us that, the desire, the object of desire is only independent, for it is a universal, indestructible essence. We're looking for something greater here. And this is going to lead him to talking about spirit. He has a beautiful little passage at the end of this. He's calling this the notion, the Begriff of spirit, not the fullness of spirit. And he says, what lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is. This absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses. The idea is we are to try to get to the point where each self-consciousness is able to attain recognition from the other self-consciousnesses and be independent. That's a very high order to try to meet, but it is possible indeed, and that's part of what he carries out there. So he ends this by talking about, here we go, independent self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence, I, that is we, and we, that is I. So he says that it is in self-consciousness that this whole notion of spirit or mind in its fullest sense emerges for us in a very implicit form that requires a lot of working out. So all of this leads us to see that self-consciousness is inextricably tied up with another self-consciousness through desire, and desire is fundamentally for recognition.